wasn't supposed to meet that man on the roadside that cold morning in Vermont. It wasn't even 6 yet, and the fog lay thick over the asphalt, the kind that makes everything feel slightly out of place, like time itself is running a minute behind. But it was the way he said my name, picking each syllable as if he was afraid of getting the year wrong, that made me slow down. People around here whisper about strangers who show up knowing a little too much. I always thought it was just the way small towns entertain themselves through the winter. He looked lost, but not in the usual sense. There was a delay in his eyes, an almost imperceptible lag between what he saw and what he reacted to, as if the world was moving a second faster than he was. It reminded me, faintly, uncomfortably, of a truck driver I once met who insisted he was heading back to a place that wasn't built yet. I'd brushed that off at the time. But this man, there was something older in his voice, something worn down in a way I couldn't place. He spoke about the woman without ever saying her name, just her, like the whole state had been holding its breath over the same person. He told me where she was with a precision that didn't make sense. A small cabin near a shallow stream that dries almost completely by late autumn, hidden by the kind of bent, crooked trees that only grow on that side of the ridge. And then he said something that made my chest tighten, that I was the only one who could reach her in time. I should have walked away. I should have ignored the strange déjà vu that washed over me, the feeling that I had stood in a moment like this once before. But there was a heaviness in his tone, a tired, worn-out certainty, that reminded me of other quiet stories from this region, things found where they shouldn't be, people arriving too early or too late, flickering lights on old back roads no one fully trusts. Vermont collects these moments like the fog collects on the trees. When he pressed a folded note into my hand, my body chilled the same way it had years ago when I stared at a clock that somehow ticked into a minute that hadn't happened yet. I didn't know whether to believe him, but I knew I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't follow what he told me. And so, on that silent morning in 1994, I turned my car toward a place a stranger claimed I needed to reach, before someone else vanished into the wrong moment of time. I kept driving for a while after I left the stranger behind, hands tight on the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that none of it made sense. Vermont was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that presses on your thoughts until they stop pretending to be reasonable. The fog clung to the treetops like it didn't want to let go, and every mile I put between myself and that roadside encounter only tightened the knot in my chest. I told myself I didn't believe him, but somehow I already knew I wasn't going home. Something about the way he spoke lingered with me. Not his words. Those were plain and simple. It was the timing of them, like he was letting pieces of the future slip through his fingers 1 second too early. I'd felt that same unease once before, years earlier, when I found an old map that marked a trail everyone swore had never existed. I dismissed that as a cartographer's mistake, a random curiosity in a quiet state. But now, driving through the morning fog of 1994, I wasn't so sure anymore. I kept replaying his expression when he mentioned her, the woman he claimed desperately needed help. There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. It wasn't a warning. It was a memory he hadn't lived yet. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt responsible for whatever was waiting at the end of that dirt road he described. By the time I reached the turnoff, a narrow path half hidden by pines, my doubt had faded into something heavier. I knew I was stepping into a moment that didn't entirely belong to me, but the only truth that mattered then was simple. Someone out there needed to be found, and if the stranger was right, I didn't have much time to get to her. Hi, my name is Andrew Keller. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you enjoy stories about moments that feel slightly out of place in time, please consider subscribing to the channel. It truly helps, and I'd be glad to have you here. What would you do if a stranger told you something impossible, but someone's life depended on believing it? Thank you to everyone who spends a little time with these stories. Now let's get back to the story. The dirt road was barely wide enough for my car, and every bump rattled something inside me that had nothing to do with the suspension. I kept glancing at the folded note on the passenger seat, as if the words on it might rearrange themselves into something sensible. They didn't. They stayed exactly as the stranger had written them. A simple description, a crude sketch of the turnoff, and a final line that felt more like a warning than a direction. Don't stop. Not today. I told myself it was nothing. just the product of a frightened mind or someone trying to involve me in a situation I didn't understand. But the forest around me grew darker the deeper I drove, even though the sun should have been rising behind the clouds. The air felt stale, unmoving. It reminded me of a morning long ago when I'd stepped into an old barn and felt, without knowing why, that something in there belonged to a different moment. I didn't like that this memory was coming back now. After nearly a mile, the trees opened just enough to reveal a narrow footpath cutting away from the road. I slowed to a crawl. The stranger had said I wouldn't see the cabin from the car, only the path leading to it. He was right. If I hadn't been looking for it, the trail would have blended into the undergrowth. I parked at an angle, half expecting someone to step out of the trees and ask what I was doing there. No one did. Everything was still. I stepped out and felt the ground soften beneath my boots. The air had that strange quietness that comes right before snow, even though it wasn't cold enough for that. As I walked, the forest seemed to absorb sound instead of producing it. My footsteps felt muted, hesitant. I kept thinking about the way the stranger had looked at me. Not pleading, not desperate, but resigned, as if he already knew my choice before I made it. The path curved around a cluster of bent pines, and that's when I saw it. A faint line of smoke rising through the branches. Thin, weak, struggling to exist. It wasn't the kind of smoke that comes from a warm fire. It was the kind that comes from something burning out. I felt my pulse quicken. Someone was inside that cabin. And whatever had brought me here, fear, intuition, or the impossible truth the stranger hinted at, it was too late to turn back now. I followed the thin column of smoke as the trees gradually thinned, their branches twisting overhead like hands unsure of whether to shield or warn me. The forest floor turned uneven, scattered with stones half buried in damp soil. I kept listening for anything. A voice, movement, even the wind through the branches. But the silence clung to everything. It felt unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath for a moment it already knew was coming. The cabin appeared only when I was nearly on top of it, emerging from the fog like something forgotten by the forest. The wood was weathered, grayed by years of harsh winters. A single window glowed faintly, though the light flickered in a way that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the constant glow of a lantern or electric bulb. It pulsed gently, unevenly, as if unsure it belonged there. I approached slowly, feeling the weight of each step. Part of me expected the stranger from the roadside to appear again, as if this were all some test he'd designed. But the memory of his tired expression lingered, convincing me he wasn't the kind of man who played games. He was the kind who'd seen too much, the kind who carried time like a burden. Near the door, I noticed footprints in the mud, faint, shallow, disturbed by recent rain. One set led toward the cabin, the other, I couldn't tell. It faded toward the tree line before disappearing entirely, as if whoever walked that way had stepped out of the world rather than deeper into it. I told myself I was imagining it. This was Vermont, not some place where time bent around people. Yet the thought refused to leave. The door itself was cracked open just enough to let out a thin ribbon of smoke. I hesitated with my hand hovering over the wood. If she was in there, the woman he'd spoken about, she could be unconscious, hurt, barely holding on. I didn't know what I'd find inside, but doing nothing felt worse than walking into the unknown. I pushed the door. It creaked softly, a sound too fragile for a moment that carried so much weight. The air inside was heavy, warm, and thick with the faint smell of burnt fabric. My eyes struggled to adjust, but I could already make out a shape on the floor. Someone was there. Someone who shouldn't have been left alone this long. She was lying near the wood stove, her body curled slightly as if she'd collapsed mid-movement. For a moment I couldn't tell if she was breathing. The dim, unsteady light inside the cabin made everything look softer than it should have been, her hair blending into the shadowed floorboards, her pale hand resting on the edge of a rug that had darkened from dampness. I knelt slowly, unsure whether touching her would help or hurt. "Ma'am?" My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, but a faint rise and fall in her chest told me she was still alive. Relief washed through me, sharp and immediate. The stranger had been right. Someone needed help here. But knowing that only raised more questions about how he could have known. I tried to push that thought aside. There would be time for doubt later. I checked for injuries. Her skin felt cold, too cold for someone indoors, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. The wood stove had died down to embers, barely giving off heat. A half-burned blanket sat beside her, singed at the edges as if she'd tried to warm herself and failed. The smell of burnt fabric now made sense. "Hang on," I murmured quietly. "I'm going to get you out of here." I lifted her carefully into my arms. She was lighter than I expected. As I turned toward the doorway, something caught my eye, a small object on the table beside the window. It was a watch, old-fashioned, the kind with a worn leather strap and a cracked face. But the hands were moving in an odd, irregular pattern, ticking forward, pausing, then jolting ahead again. It struck me with a cold familiarity I didn't want to acknowledge. I forced myself not to linger on it. I carried her outside, where the air felt sharper and cleaner than in the suffocating cabin. The forest watched silently as I moved toward the car, its branches still heavy with fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, not just the cabin, but an explanation I didn't yet understand. As I settled her into the back seat, she stirred for the first time. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and she whispered something too soft for me to catch. I leaned in, trying to hear. Her lips trembled, forming a single word that sent a chill straight through me. "Late." Her whisper lingered in the cold air long after her eyes closed again. Late. It wasn't a word you expect from someone barely conscious. Not help, not please, not even where am I. Just late, like she was commenting on something already decided, something irreversible. I tried to tell myself it meant nothing, that her mind was drifting, grasping for whatever scraps of awareness were left. But it didn't feel random. It felt directed. I shut the car door gently and walked around to the driver's seat, trying to steady my breathing. The forest seemed even quieter now, almost cautious. I kept glancing at the path, half expecting the stranger to appear out of the fog again, as if checking whether I'd done what he asked. But the woods remained still, the only movement the faint drift of smoke from the cabin's chimney. I started the engine. The sound felt intrusive in that silence, like breaking an unspoken agreement with the morning. The tires struggled for a moment on the damp ground before finding traction. As I pulled onto the narrow road, I checked the rearview mirror. Her head had slumped to the side, her breathing visible in slight, uneven breaths. She needed help fast. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The fog clung to the trees like it didn't want to let us go, trailing behind the car in slow, ghostly ribbons. I kept thinking about the watch on the table inside the cabin, the way its hands had skipped and hesitated, refusing to settle into a proper rhythm. It reminded me of something from years ago, a clock that would stop whenever someone approached it, only to resume ticking once they stepped away. A harmless curiosity, I'd thought. Now, I wasn't so sure. As I drove, her voice replayed in my mind. Not the word itself, but the tone, weary, certain, resigned. People who are dying don't usually sound resigned. They sound scared, confused, desperate. She hadn't. She sounded like someone confirming what she already suspected. Halfway down the road, she stirred again. I glanced in the mirror. Her eyes were open now, though barely, unfocused but aimed upward, as if she were looking at something far beyond the ceiling of my car. "Not yet," she whispered. This time I heard it clearly. Not late, not early, not yet. I didn't know what it meant, but whatever it wasn't for me. The road widened slightly as I left the deeper forest behind, but the sense of unease didn't ease with it. Her whisper kept circling my thoughts, slipping into the spaces between them. Not yet. It sounded less like a warning and more like a reminder, as if she was aware of something I couldn't see, something approaching, but not here, not now. I kept one hand on the wheel and one eye on the mirror, watching her chest rise and fall in unsteady patterns. A faint color returned to her face, though it didn't look like warmth. It was more like a flicker, a momentary spark that struggled to hold itself together. She shifted slightly, her fingers curling weakly against the seat. For a moment I wondered if she recognized where she was, or who I was, but her eyes didn't focus on anything in the car. They seemed fixed on something deeper, something far beyond the interior of a '94 sedan. I tried speaking again. "Can you hear me? We're getting you help. Just hold on." She didn't respond, though her breathing quickened. A small tremor traveled through her shoulders, then faded just as quickly. I wasn't sure whether it meant she was waking up or slipping away. I'd dealt with shock before. Anyone who's lived through Vermont winters learns the signs. But this felt different. It wasn't just her body shutting down. It felt like her awareness was drifting somewhere else entirely, pulled toward something I couldn't pull her back from. The fog began to thin as the road descended toward the main highway. The sight of the open stretch ahead should have brought relief, but instead it filled me with a strange heaviness. I kept expecting her to speak again, to whisper another word that carried too much weight, but she remained quiet, her face turned slightly toward the window, as if listening to something outside. A soft tapping sound interrupted my thoughts, not from her, not from the car, but from her jacket pocket. I frowned, glancing back again. The sound repeated, a faint, irregular click. I hesitated a moment before reaching back during a straight stretch of road. My hand brushed against something cold, small, metallic. I pulled it free. It was another watch, but this one wasn't broken. Its hands were spinning slowly, backward. I nearly swerved. Whatever was happening to her wasn't just physical. It was tied to something pulling at time itself. I held the watch in my hand longer than I should have, staring at the soft, backward rotation of its hands. It wasn't fast or dramatic, nothing that would jump out at someone not paying close attention, but it was undeniable. Each second ticked in reverse, steady and quiet, as if time itself had simply changed its mind. I felt a chill settling into my chest. This wasn't the kind of thing you could explain later, not to the police, not to anyone. Even I didn't believe what I was seeing. I set the watch on the passenger seat, unsure whether keeping it close was wise or reckless. Her breathing hitched behind me, followed by a soft, trembling exhale. I checked the mirror again. Her eyes were half open now, not with awareness, but with the fragile confusion of someone waking from a dream they aren't ready to leave. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, through the windshield, through the fog, through something I couldn't see. We're almost there, I told her, though I didn't know if she heard. Just stay with me. For a moment, her lips parted. I leaned closer to the mirror, hoping for another word, another clue, but no sound came out. Instead, her gaze shifted downward, toward the front of the car, not at the dashboard, lower, toward the floor, as if she sensed something beneath us, something approaching in silence. A shiver crawled up my spine. I forced myself to look away from the mirror and focus on the road. The highway was less than a mile ahead now. Once I reached it, I could head straight toward the nearest town with a proper station and medical help. Everything would make sense again. It had to. But as the fog thinned further, she suddenly whispered a new word, so faint I wasn't sure I heard it correctly. Turn. I froze. Turn where? Her expression tightened, pained. Not physically, something deeper. Her eyes shifted toward the tree line on the right, as though urging me toward a narrow dirt path I'd driven past 100 times without noticing. There's nothing there, I said, half to her, half to myself. Her voice came again, strained, barely more than breath. Not yet. The same phrase, the same quiet conviction. I didn't know what weighted down that unseen road. But I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that ignoring her wasn't an option anymore. I slowed the car almost without realizing it, her whisper echoing through the cabin long after she fell silent again. The turnoff she seemed to be pointing toward wasn't a road so much as a break in the trees, a narrow opening swallowed by undergrowth and shadow. I'd passed it countless times and never once noticed it. Maybe most people didn't. Maybe it wasn't meant to be seen most days. The highway was so close I could almost taste the relief it promised. A straight drive, people, help, answers. Logic told me to keep going. But something in her voice, that fragile certainty, held me in place. She wasn't asking me to save her. She was asking me to follow a moment that didn't exist yet. I pulled to the side and let the engine idle. The fog moved lazily across the forest, curling around the branches like it was hiding more than it revealed. Behind me, she breathed in shallow, unsteady pulls, each one sounding borrowed. I looked back at her, hoping for clarity. Her eyes were half open again, but they weren't looking at me. They were fixed on that hidden path through the trees, as if she expected someone, or something, to appear. This doesn't make sense, I muttered, rubbing my hands together to calm the tremor in them. I'm trying to help you, but I can't keep guessing. I didn't expect an answer, but she moved slightly, her fingers brushing against her jacket where the strange watch had been. The backward turning hands flashed across my memory, steady and relentless. Maybe this wasn't about guessing. Maybe it was about timing. I took a slow breath and turned the wheel, easing the car toward the narrow opening. Branches scraped the side as if the forest were reluctant to let us in. The path angled downward almost immediately, dipping into a pocket of land where the fog thickened again. The temperature dropped, subtle but noticeable, a cold that felt older than the season. A few yards in, the trees opened just enough to reveal a clearing. Small, silent, empty, or so I thought, because in the center of that clearing, lying half hidden in the flattened grass, was something unmistakable. A second set of tire tracks, fresh, still damp from the morning fog, and heading deeper into the woods, toward a place I didn't know existed. Not yet. The tire tracks cut through the clearing like a scar, pressed deep enough into the wet earth that I knew they weren't old. Whoever drove through here had done so recently, maybe minutes before I arrived. I leaned forward, gripping the wheel tightly as a sudden wave of unease passed through me. The woman in the back seat shifted, letting out a faint, strained sound, almost as if she recognized the place even in her weakened state. I stepped out of the car and crouched near the tracks. They pointed toward a narrower trail that curved deeper into the forest, swallowed quickly by fog and shadow. I couldn't make out where it led, but something about the path tugged at me. The same pull I'd felt when the stranger had spoken to me on the roadside. A strange, familiar wrongness, like stepping into a moment that wasn't meant for me yet. Behind me, the woman whispered again. Not words this time. Something closer to a breath cut short, a fragile thread unraveling. I hurried back to the car, opening the door to check her pulse. It beat faintly beneath her skin, as if her body was trying to keep pace with something it no longer understood. Her eyes fluttered open long enough to look past me, toward the woods. Someone went ahead, she murmured. The words chilled me. She couldn't possibly know that. She hadn't seen the tracks. She hadn't even lifted her head. Who? I asked softly. She swallowed weakly. Her voice came out thin, fading. He came early. I froze. The stranger, or someone like him. The trees creaked overhead, a low groan stirred by wind or something less natural. The clearing felt heavier now, as if time itself had settled unevenly across the ground. I didn't know what I expected to find deeper in the woods, but every instinct seemed to tug me forward, insisting the moment demanded something from me, even if I didn't know what. I rested my hand briefly on the car door, steadying myself. I couldn't leave her alone, and I couldn't drive her away from whatever she believed was waiting, not yet. I needed to make a choice. Follow the signs of someone who didn't belong here, or get her to safety while there was still time. Before I could decide, a faint noise drifted up the trail. A distant, irregular tapping, metal against wood, or something trying to keep its own time. The tapping continued, slow, uneven, almost hesitant. It echoed through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell how far away it was. It could have been 20 yards. It could have been 50. The forest distorted everything, stretching sounds into shapes they didn't normally take. I stood still beside the car, listening, trying to separate the noise from the fog-dampened stillness around us. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than before, as if the woods had swallowed the sound whole. I glanced back at the woman. Her eyes were half open again, unfocused but fixed toward the direction of the trail. She wasn't afraid, or rather her expression wasn't one of fear. It was something else. A sadness maybe, a kind of quiet acceptance, as if she already knew what the sound meant. Who's out there? I asked softly, not expecting an answer. She didn't speak. Instead, her hand moved slightly, trembling as it reached toward her jacket pocket again, where the backwards turning watch had been. Her fingers brushed empty fabric. She frowned, a faint crease forming between her brows, as though realizing something important was missing. She whispered, "He's close." I swallowed hard. I didn't want to ask who she meant, but the question formed anyway. "The man from the cabin?" I asked. "The one who knew where you were?" She shook her head just barely. "Not him." Her breath caught. "The other one." A cold heaviness settled at the base of my spine. I turned slowly toward the trail again, staring into the dense curtain of fog. Something was out there. Someone, and the forest felt different because of it. Charged, waiting, like the moment before a storm when the air thickens but the first drop hasn't fallen. I opened the driver's door, torn between fleeing and staying rooted exactly where I stood. The weight of the choice pressed down on me. If I pushed deeper into the woods, I'd drag her into danger she wasn't strong enough to face. If I drove away, I might be turning my back on something that wasn't finished yet, something time itself was steering me toward. The forest creaked again, this time closer. A soft crunch followed, like a footstep settling into damp leaves. I tightened my grip on the door. Whatever or whoever was approaching had already found us. There was no "not yet" left, only now. The moment held itself together for a few seconds, just long enough for me to hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, mixing with the faint rasp of hers. Then the quiet shifted. Not louder, not sharper, just different, as if the forest had adjusted itself to make room for whatever was approaching. A figure emerged through the fog, not all at once. First a silhouette, then the faint outline of shoulders, then the blurred suggestion of a coat that hung too still for the faint breeze that threaded through the trees. He paused at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a cluster of pines, as though testing the air before stepping into it. I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. He wasn't the stranger from the roadside, not even close. The man who had spoken to me hours earlier had carried a quiet exhaustion, a softness around the edges, as if time had worn him down. But the figure standing before me was rigid, composed with an eerie, deliberate stillness. He didn't sway. He didn't shift. He simply stood, as if the only thing anchoring him to the world was the moment itself. The woman in the back seat stirred weakly. "Don't," she whispered. Her voice barely reached me, but it was enough to snap me out of my frozen state. I reached back into the car and touched her shoulder. "Do you know him?" I asked quietly. Her eyes fluttered open just enough for me to see the fear there. Not frantic fear, but something deeper. A fear rooted not in the man himself, but in what his presence meant. "He wasn't supposed to find us," she murmured. "Not yet." That phrase again. It carried a weight I didn't understand, a timing, an order of events that I didn't have the map for. The backward-turning watch flashed in my mind, along with the stranger's warning, his urgency, his resignation. Nothing about today had followed the normal sequence of cause and effect. I wasn't sure anything still could. The figure took one slow, measured step forward. I stepped back instinctively, my hand hovering near the car door, unsure whether to get inside or run deeper into the woods. Something about the man's movement chilled me. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't natural either. It was as if he moved in perfect alignment with something unseen, like he was following an invisible metronome the rest of us couldn't hear. He stopped only a few yards away, the fog curling at his ankles. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're early." His words hit harder than I expected. "You're early." They weren't spoken with accusation or relief, just quiet certainty, the way someone might comment on the weather or the hour, as if he weren't talking about me at all, but about the moment itself. "I don't know what you mean," I managed, though my voice felt thin in the still air. The man tilted his head slightly, studying me with an expression that held no malice, no urgency, only a detached curiosity, as if he were assessing how far off course this moment had drifted. His eyes flicked toward the woman in the back seat, and something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, like he recognized her or had expected her to be somewhere else entirely. Behind me, she inhaled sharply, a sound that was more memory than breath. I turned, instinctively wanting to shield her from whatever this was. Her eyes were open now, wide with a clarity she hadn't had since I found her in the cabin. "No," she whispered, voice cracking under the weight of the word. "Not him. Not now." The man's calm expression didn't change. "It's all right," he said softly, directing his words not at her, but at the moment between us. "I'm only here to correct the timing." My skin prickled. "What timing?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He stepped closer, not threateningly, not with purpose, but with the careful precision of someone moving between fragile pieces of a puzzle. The fog parted slightly around him, as if it recognized his presence. I felt a coldness settle through my ribs, a quiet shift in the air that made the forest seem suddenly aware of itself. "You weren't meant to arrive until after," he said. "After she's found, after the moment settles, after the hour holds still." His gaze returned to the woman. "This wasn't the sequence." She shook her head weakly, her voice trembling. "He helped me. Yes, the man replied gently. But not yet. Something in those words hollowed out the space between us. A deep ache rose in her expression, a mix of regret and inevitability that made my chest tighten. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of the time he represented. I stepped forward, instinct overriding understanding. "Who are you?" I demanded. He looked at me with surprising softness. "I am what comes when moments fall out of place." His answer hung in the air with a strange, fragile heaviness, as if even speaking it risked disturbing something delicate. I didn't understand it. Not fully. But something inside me recognized the truth in his voice. It wasn't confidence or authority. It was inevitability. The kind you hear in the quiet moments of your own life, when something is about to shift and you're powerless to stop it. The man took another step, his movements perfectly measured, as if he were aligning himself with something invisible. Behind me, the woman tried to sit up, struggling against the weakness in her limbs. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not yet. You said I had until—" "I know what I said," he interrupted gently, though he didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the clearing, the fog, the trees, as if reading an unseen clock stretching across the landscape. "But you were found sooner than intended, and that changes everything." Her breathing grew harsher, each inhale sounding like it tore at something deep inside her. I reached for her hand without thinking, trying to anchor her to something real. She held on, barely. "I helped her," I said, my voice unsteady. "She needed to be found." The man finally looked at me again, his expression neither approving nor condemning. "You did what anyone with a conscience would do." A pause. But the moment wasn't yours to move. A cold anger flickered through me. "She would have died in that cabin." He nodded slowly, almost mournfully. "Yes, she would have." And that was the moment meant to settle. A still point, a fixed point. His eyes softened. Her life wasn't the only thing tied to it. The meaning of his words cut deeper than I expected. I looked back at the woman. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes, glassy, unfocused, held a grief that didn't belong to someone escaping death. It belonged to someone losing something they were never meant to have. "I wasn't supposed to leave," she whispered. "Not then. Not like this." The man reached into his coat and pulled out something small, metal catching faint light through the fog. I tensed, but his movement remained calm, deliberate. It was a watch. Old, worn, its hands trembling. Not ticking forward, not ticking backward. Just shaking, as if caught between two seconds that refused to agree. The man held it carefully. "When a moment breaks," he said softly, "time sends someone to mend the tear." He looked at her with a sorrow I didn't expect. And today, that someone is me. The clearing felt smaller than before, as if the fog had crept inward to listen. I stood there, frozen between the man with the trembling watch and the woman fading slowly in the back seat. The world around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which moment would take root in the ground beneath our feet. I tightened my grip on the car door, unsure of what I was trying to hold steady, myself, her, or whatever thin thread of sense was left in the morning. The man turned the watch slightly in his hand, and the trembling of the second hand grew more pronounced. It wasn't ticking at all. It was shivering, like it was caught between two answers. "She wasn't meant to leave that cabin," he murmured, examining the watch as if it were a living thing. "Not yet." His voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't even disappointed. It carried a kind of sadness that felt deeper than grief, like he'd seen too many moments slip into the wrong order. I wanted to deny everything he said, to argue that saving a life could never be wrong, but the forest around us felt too still for simple answers. The fog pulsed faintly, almost in rhythm with the trembling second hand. The woman exhaled a long, fragile breath. I rushed to her side, leaning into the back seat. Her skin had gone colder, her eyelids fluttering like they were losing their grip on the world. She didn't look at me at first. Her gaze drifted over the clearing, toward the path the tire tracks had carved deeper into the woods. "He came early," she whispered. I looked toward the man again, but he shook his head slowly. "Not me," he said. "The other one." Before I could speak, she reached for my hand, her grip weaker than before. "You weren't supposed to find me," she said softly. "Not you." "Then who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who was supposed to?" Her expression tightened with pain, not physical but emotional, like remembering something she wished she could forget. Someone who was meant to be here. Someone tied to this moment. The man stepped closer, the watch trembling more violently now. "Moments need the right witness," he said. "The right sequence. When the wrong person arrives, the hour doesn't settle." I shook my head, anger flaring. I didn't ask for any of this. I just did what anyone would do. He met my eyes with gentle certainty. "That's why it wasn't yours." The forest groaned softly, as if agreeing. I glanced down. The woman's eyes were brimming, not with fear, but with resignation. She squeezed my hand, barely. "You tried to help," she whispered. "But saving me, break something else." Her voice wavered, and he came to fix it. The man lifted the trembling watch. "It's time," he said quietly. The second hand froze, and everything around us seemed to wait. The moment the second hand froze, a strange stillness fell across the clearing. Not silence. Silence is natural. This was something heavier, something that felt like the absence of sound rather than its pause. Even the breeze seemed to bow to whatever was happening, settling against the pine needles in a way that made the entire forest hold its breath. The man lowered the trembling watch, turning it slightly as if confirming something only he could see. "It's starting," he said softly. I didn't know what it was, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. My attention went to the woman again. Her breathing had slowed to a fragile, uneven rhythm, each inhale a struggle. But there was something else in her expression now, a distant focus, as if she was aware of something unfolding beyond the clearing. "I shouldn't have left," she whispered. "I told him I wouldn't, but I didn't want to die alone." Her words hit harder than the cold air ever could. "You weren't alone," I said quickly. "You're not." She shook her head weakly, closing her eyes for a moment. "Not the way I meant." The man stepped closer, though his presence didn't feel threatening. It felt inevitable. "There are moments meant to be endings," he said. "Still points in a timeline. When they're changed, the hours that follow begin to tear." He knelt beside her with surprising gentleness, as if he'd done this before. 1,000 times, maybe. The trembling watch glinted in his hand. "You weren't meant to be saved today." I felt something in me twist painfully. Anger, guilt, disbelief. They all collided inside my chest. "She would have died," I said. "How can saving her be wrong?" The man looked up at me, and there was no judgment in his eyes. "Saving a life is never wrong," he said. "But doing it at the wrong hour, that can break more than you see." She looked at me then, not with blame, but with a softness that made my throat tighten. "You weren't supposed to carry this," she said. "He was." "Who?" I asked again, helpless. Her lips parted, forming a name I didn't recognize, a whisper lost halfway through breath. Someone she must have loved, someone she must have expected, someone who never arrived. A faint low hum drifted through the clearing. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural either. It was like time itself was vibrating, adjusting, preparing. The man lifted the watch again, and the second hand slowly, painfully, began to move, but not forward or backward. It slid sideways, trembling against the glass as though trying to escape the circle it was trapped in. "She's slipping," he murmured. I leaned closer, panic tightening in my chest. "What's happening?" "She's returning to her moment." No, I brought her out. I saved her." He shook his head gently. "You delayed her ending, but you can't erase it." Her hand reached for mine again, her grip barely a shadow of what it had been. "Thank you," she whispered, "for letting me see one more morning." Her eyes glistened with something between gratitude and sorrow. "It's time," the man repeated, not unkindly, and the forest seemed to bend around her breathing, preparing for the moment it knew was coming. Her breathing thinned until each inhale felt like a fragile argument against whatever was trying to pull her away. I held her hand gently, afraid that anything stronger would shatter the moment, or her. The man knelt beside us with a kind of solemn patience, as if he were waiting for the hour to quietly click back into place. The trembling watch glowed faintly in the dim light, its second hand scraping softly against the glass like it was trying to move but couldn't decide which direction to choose. The woman's eyes fluttered open again, and this time they stayed open a little longer. They didn't look lost or afraid. They looked relieved, like the burden she'd been carrying had grown lighter now that the moment she'd tried to outrun had finally caught up. "I wasn't ready," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "That's why I left. That's why I hid." The man nodded gently. "Most people aren't. Moments end whether we accept them or not." She turned her head slightly toward me, and for a second, the fog thinned enough for the morning light to touch her face. She looked younger, calmer, as if the fear that had driven her into the cabin had dissolved. "You helped me," she said softly. "You gave me time I wasn't meant to have, but I'm glad I had it." Her fingers tightened weakly around mine. One last human gesture, warm despite the cold settling into her skin. I swallowed hard. "I didn't come to change anything. I just didn't want you to die alone." A faint smile touched her lips. "No one wants to." The forest let out a long, low groan, branches shifting, the ground settling, as if the world itself were acknowledging something passing. The hum that had lingered in the air began to fade, pulled back into whatever quiet place it had come from. Her breathing slowed again, this time with a cadence that felt steady in its fading, as though she were aligning with something larger than herself. The man lifted the watch, and for the first time, the second hand moved, one slow, graceful tick. She exhaled, but she didn't inhale again. The watch ticked twice more, then stopped. The man closed the watch gently, almost with reverence, and slipped it back inside his coat. The fog shifted, lifting slightly from the clearing as though the forest was releasing the pressure it had been holding. "She's home," he said quietly. I felt her hand loosen in mine, the last trace of warmth fading. A numb ache spread through my chest. Not anger, not disbelief, just a hollow sorrow for a moment I wasn't meant to save but couldn't walk away from. The man stood slowly, steadying himself as if stepping out of a long, delicate sequence. "She won't suffer anymore," he added, "but you need to leave. This moment isn't done with its adjustments." I looked at him, trying to understand. "What happens now?" He met my eyes with a calm, worn-out certainty. "Now," he said softly. "Now the world figures out what to do with someone who arrived too early, and someone who wasn't meant to be saved." I don't remember driving back to town. I don't remember starting the engine, or turning the car around, or watching the fog drift past the windshield like it didn't want to let go of me. What I do remember is the weight, not the weight of her body. I'd already felt that go light in my arms. It was the weight of the moment settling, folding itself into something I couldn't name. By the time I reached the main road, the fog had lifted enough for the morning sun to show through, thin and pale. It should have brought clarity. It didn't. Everything in me felt misaligned, as if I'd stepped out of a moment not meant for me and dragged its consequences along with me. I drove straight to the nearest station. It felt like the only thing I could do. Report what happened, get her the help I couldn't give, explain everything I saw. But when the officers opened the door and asked where I'd come from, the words refused to come out the way I needed them to. Saying "a stranger told me where she was" sounded impossible even to my own ears. Saying time sent someone to collect her was unthinkable. All I managed was the truth stripped bare. I found her in a cabin. I tried to save her. She didn't make it. And somehow, that was the version that made me look guilty. Maybe it was the dirt on my clothes. Maybe it was the timeline that didn't line up the way it should have. Maybe it was my own shaken voice, stumbling over details because I'd lived through something I couldn't describe. Or maybe the moment hadn't finished settling yet. Either way, the questions kept coming, and the looks changed. I'd gone into those woods to help someone, and by the end of the day, they were treating me like someone who needed to be stopped.